that has bothered us for a long time is African polygamy. If it is true that the woman is equal, how come can a man have several wives? Now, polygamy is one of the most gravely misunderstood things. Not every African could be polygamous. You had to be very wealthy and very prosperous to be polygamous. In the case of kings, polygamy was permitted both in European, Asian, American, and African worlds because it was necessary for a king to have several wives. Regardless of who was he picked as his queen, he had to have several wives or his kingdom would break up. The reason for that was that if there were 12 tribes or 12 peoples in a kingdom, you could not pick one from one tribe because you would insult the others. So that you had to have in your harem a woman from each representing each. But one of the things that people misunderstood, they thought that polygamy arose out of some kind of lust. Polygamous institution at its best was not a man having many wives to satisfy his lust. The problem was that they had to have some sort of social institution to protect unmarried women. Not everyone in the harem, therefore, was married by the man. A man's mother could be in his harem. A man's sister could be in his harem. Those are not his women in his sexual sense, but they are part of the household that he must maintain. And to marry a woman was no simple matter. One didn't just flick one's fingers and marry. One had to maintain that woman and her children. The Africans were very serious about that. I spent a year in Africa studying law, Swahili law. I wrote the Swahili dictionary, the first Swahili dictionary of law. And I had to go about the courts in Africa, and when I was coming out of Europe, my teachers told me, you see, the African doesn't really respect women, because in Muslim law, all you have to say is, Nimikuacha, 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 I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and it's all over. When I got into Africa, I found it was not true. The only woman you could tell that to is a virgin. If you married a woman behind a veil and you lifted the veil off that night and you were quite unpleasantly surprised by what you saw, you could say to her, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and walk away. But once you entered her, you were in serious trouble. The law would follow that through and see whether she became pregnant. If she did, you would have to support that child. There was no nonsense about that. That was hard law. Wherever I went, it was hard law. And in fact, there was one case that came before me. That is the first time in my life I dropped English for half an hour. It has never happened again. I learned several languages, but I never dropped English in my head. I would make quick computerized translations. But once I was sitting in the court, and I was being treated as a magistrate because although I had tried to convince the people I was working with in Africa that I was not a magistrate, that I was not inspecting the books, in England, I got the word kuchagua mixed up with another word. And kuchagua is not to inspect as an inspector, but it also means that you are examining and checking these people out. So every time I said, I have come here, kuchagua, to inspect the books, the magistrate would start to tremble because he think I was sent from the central government, Nyerere's government, to check him out. So sometimes I would find all court business would stop because this curious, strange inspector had arrived. Now, when I started to really inspect those cases, I began to discover 99% of the divorce cases were brought by women. And women had a right to demand things out of men if they were not supporting their children, and to demand things out of them if they disappeared. They could even take their property away if they suddenly decided to disappear in order to relinquish their responsibility. And in that polygamous institution, it wasn't a case of a man standing like a great lord That was the extremely prosperous men who had to give land to each woman he married, to build great farms, to have some enormous agricultural enterprise perhaps. Then you have situations like that. The ordinary man could not do any such thing. It's therefore important to understand it in a certain perspective. The independence of women, in fact, under polygamy, made her acquire powers greater than in Europe. So that whereas the woman in Europe emerged as a kind of serf to the man, and it is only quite recently because of strange new economic changes, sudden economic changes in Western economy, women have become as powerful as men. So powerful and so sudden is that power in the European world that lots of men retreat into homosexuality. They're not accustomed to finding equality in women. But in the African world, you do not find the same thing happening. Because when the woman entered market economy, you found many West African women having independence. Even before the slave trade, those West African women acquired an independence, an economic independence, which gave them a certain power and equality. And if the men were mad enough not to respect them in a certain way, they had various ways to deal with that lack of respect. It wasn't polygamy, because polygamy in Africa sprang out of prosperity and stability. The polygamous relationships here sprang out of the opposite, economic insecurity and instability. The plural liaisons with women, therefore, sprang out of an incapacity to stand one's ground, to have firm, stable relationships with women. And then what made things even